the Fire and Police Commission meeting on March 23rd, starting at 4:02. Can we take roll call?
Commissioner Zepeda. Commissioner Zepeda, not present. Commissioner Herlinger.
Present.
Commissioner Hill, not present. Vice Chair Dozer. Here. And Chair Rodriguez.
Here.
Thank you.
Moving on to item 3, are there any changes to the agenda that staff or commissioners would like to make? Nope. Okay, moving on to item 4, general public comment. This is a time for the public, either in person or online, to make a comment about items that are not on our current agenda. Do we have any public comment requests?
We do not.
Okay. Moving on to item 5, approval of minutes from last month, February 23rd, 2023. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve those minutes?
I move approval.
I second that.
And a vote?
So we've moved the minutes for February 23rd, 2023, moved by Commissioner Herlinger, second by Vice Chair Dozer. Go ahead and place your votes. Votes complete.
Okay, all in favor? 3 yes, no, 0 no, 0 abstained. So moving on to item 6, we're just moving along quickly here. Presentation, moving on to item 6.
Thank you. Item 6, presentation on California Senate Bill 2, Peace Officers, Certification, Civil Rights.
As it appears. Good afternoon, Chair Rodriguez and members of our illustrious Fire and Police Commission. Good afternoon. So don't let the number of slides daunt you. I'm going to go through this material quickly enough, but I wanted to make sure that within it, once these are published, that you'll have access to additional information other than just my overview. For those of you that don't know, I'm actually a post-commissioner, and I actually spent yesterday at the post-commission meeting, so I'm very familiar with SB 2, and I can also share with you that there's a lot of changes in law enforcement in California as a result of SB 2, but the other portion of it, there's still a lot of changes as SB 2 gets implemented. So implementation has just started at the first of the year. And, there's a lot of processes that go into passing all the regulations that happen. So as the commission has voted on different things, it has gone back and then come back to us from the administrative law department with other changes. So now that it's being implemented, I expect that there'll be some more changes to this, but I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of it as we work through it. So SB 2, really basically the quick and dirty of it is it now creates decertification and certification for all peace officers in the state of California. It now allows for a mechanism to revoke or suspend that certification due to serious misconduct. And I want you to keep serious misconduct in mind because that is a key component of it, and we're going to talk specifically about that, what that is as we move forward. And this applies to all peace officers, regardless of whether or not they're a post-participating agency. The way the legislature is written, it doesn't define it as only if you're a post-participating agency. And then I want to give you kind of a quick overview if you don't know what POST is. I don't want to assume that you do. POST is the Peace Officer Standards and Training for the state of California. So that is what regulates all of the academies, all of the what we call post-certified training that we all have to go to. They're the ones responsible for making sure that our backgrounds and everything that we do meet the required set of standards. So for us, we get audited every 2 years. All of our background packets is audited by POST, all of the training to make sure that we meet the 24 hours within the 2-year training cycle. All of that is regulated by POST. And then there's the Post Commission, which I'm a commissioner on, which has different representatives that set up legislatively. There are those outside of law enforcement that sit on it. There's those from inside law enforcement. There's different seats that are specified within the Post Commission. You can always go to the Post website. There's a ton of information on it, but you can specifically see who's on the commission and what that looks like. SB 2 went into effect on January 1st, 2022. However, most of the regulations that go with it just went into effect January 1st, 2023. It did create the new Peace Officer Standards and Accountability Division within Post, and a new Peace Officer Standards Accountability Advisory Board. And that advisory board is is an outside advisory board that will advise the commission in cases of decertification. And created a whole bunch of new commission responsibilities. So for SB 2, just real briefly, there are different categories, quote unquote, defined by the law of different peace officer provisions. These are all the ones that fall under SB 2. So it just gives you a full list of that. But like I said earlier, it doesn't matter whether you are a post-participating agency or not. If you meet the definition of a peace officer under any of these, then you are subject to SB 2. So life cycle of a career, and I think this would be a good educational point, not just within SB 2, but to give you an overall of what the career looks like for a police officer. So there is the very intense hiring selection process. Then you get appointed as a peace officer. Now you get a proof of eligibility or your basic certificate. So if you get appointed before you go to the academy and before you've completed the probationary period, which is what you have to do to get your base basic certificate. So post basic certificate requires you to attend the academy and complete probation before you get that piece of paper in your hand that says that you have your post basic. So either you have your post basic or you have a proof of eligibility prior to that, which means that you have shown that you meet all of the hiring standards required under SB 2 and all the other sections of the law. And you hopefully go throughout a 30 to 35 year career, and then you separate employment, whether, hopefully that's by retirement. As part of SB 2, when someone applies, and I think you'll see this when we'll go through a recruitment and hiring portion when we do some training for the commission. But the first thing that you fill out is a personal history statement. And that doesn't matter whether you're new to the department or whether you're a brand new to policing or whether you're just brand new to a new department. So like when I came here, I went through this entire process. It's considered a lateral move. You still go back through the entire hiring process. So you complete a very thorough personal history statement. This also updated the background investigation manual, investigator training requirements. Now for eligibility to become a peace officer, there are new disqualifiers. So prior to this, if you were discharged from the military, not always does that look as the same as a crime under the California Penal Code. Now, if you are discharged from the military for something that would constitute a crime, that is a felony in California, you are not eligible to become a peace officer. So I can't give you a great example off the top of my head. I should have thought of one beforehand, but that's the basic. So if you're, court-martialed and go through something in the military that would now be considered a felony, you can no longer be a police officer. And that is actually not just for any new hire, it's actually for anyone that's already a peace officer. Felony conviction that was vacated and the court found them to be unless the court found them factually innocent. Conviction for specific crimes of dishonesty or corruption, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor. A civil, military, or administrative adjudication for listed crime of dishonesty. If you've had your certificate previously revoked or you voluntarily surrendered it or it was denied, once that happens, you can no longer be a peace officer. And if you have been decertified in another jurisdiction for conduct that would result in decertification in California, you can no longer be a peace officer in California. An example would be, say you had been working in Arizona as a peace officer, you were decertified there, and now you want to come work in California, we now have to check the National Decertification Database, and you would not be eligible to work in the state of California. You now have to be at least 21 years of age at the time of appointment to be a peace officer. And whether or not an agency is a post-participating agency or not, doesn't matter. You still have to follow all of these same rules and regulations. It applies to peace officers with previous law enforcement experience, in the sense that, of course, like I had to go through a whole background process. So you go through all of that. So now, if you're trying to lateral, is what we call it. So if you're trying to go from one agency to another, we have to go back to the agency that you're coming from and make sure that we review all the records that show any type of misconduct that you've ever had in your background package. So other agencies have to give us access to that material. Not that they didn't before, but now the law specifically spells out what we have to do with that. That refers to the same that we just talked about. And now with Post having a decertification database and a misconduct database, now you also have to contact Post and get any records that Post may have in relation to that officer when they're trying to lateral to another department. And it may not even be lateral. It may be that they were hired and terminated, or any type of misconduct whatsoever that even didn't result in termination or decertification. So now when we hire someone, we, within 10 days of hiring them, have to do a proof of eligibility, or if they have not got their basic certificate, or at least show their basic certificate within 10 days of hire at this point. And we actually now have to sign a form that says that they meet all of the hiring standards under SB 2. And that that proof of eligibility is not transferable from one department to another. So anytime you move from one agency to another, you're required to do all of the same things and get a new proof of eligibility. So it doesn't mean like you just do it once at the beginning of your career and you change later on. Anytime you change, you have to redo that. So now the new Peace Officer Standards Accountability Division responsibilities. So when they get investigations that have been conducted by law enforcement agencies such as ourselves, they review it to see if there are grounds for suspension or revocation of their certification. If they think there's grounds exist, then they present those findings and recommendations to the commission, and then they bring proceedings against the officer in question and seeking that certification is revoked or suspended. They're not in the business of conducting their own internal affairs investigation, so it's not where something goes to them and they do the investigation for the departments. They can request more information from the departments if they feel that there's more information lacking in making a determination, but they are not doing internal affairs investigations on behalf of the agencies. So we can't request them to do our investigations or anything like that. They're a review body. So now, reporting potential misconduct. We have to report within 10 days any allegation of conduct that could result in decertification. Any investigative findings that could result in decertifications, findings by a civilian oversight entity or police chief that an officer engaged in conduct that could result in decertification, a civil judgment or court finding against an officer based on conduct that could result in decertification, any settlement of a civil claim alleging conduct that could result in decertification. So it's actually a really comprehensive list, and it's not just for those investigations that we find that there was some type of misconduct. It doesn't matter what our findings are. And we have to report it within 10 days, even before we've had a chance to actually investigate. So it's based simply on the allegation. And like I said, any civil claim settlement has to be reported, even if whatever the reason that claim was, whether the city felt it was in their best interest or not, it doesn't matter whether we find any type of finding that there was misconduct by the officer. We still have to report it to post. So now here's the million-dollar question. What is serious misconduct? What can get you decertified? So there's 9 areas. There is additional information on each of them. I'm not going to go through it because it's kind of getting in the weeds, but I'd be happy to answer questions if you need more information on any of them. So dishonesty relating to the reporting, investigation, or prosecution of a crime or officer misconduct, abuse of power such as intimidating a witness, false confession, making a false arrest, physical abuse, which includes excessive or unreasonable force, sexual assault, which is specifically defined in the penal code, demonstrating bias on the basis of legally protected status, race, national origin, religion, gender identity, etc. Egregious or repeated violations of the law to be inconsistent with a peace officer's obligation to uphold the law or respect the rights of members of the public, participation in a law enforcement gang, failure to cooperate with an investigation of potential police misconduct, failure to intercede when present and observing another officer use force clearly beyond what is necessary. So those are the 9 areas of misconduct that are considered serious misconduct. So those are the 9 things, the 9 categories that can result in decertification or suspension. Now, that doesn't mean that an officer couldn't do something that I, as the chief, deem an offense where I terminate them, but it doesn't meet one of those 9 in terms of whatever the behavior is. Doesn't necessarily then mean that their certification would get revoked or suspended. It has to meet, the law is very specific, it has to meet one of those 9 categories. But it also doesn't limit a police chief from still making a finding where you could terminate an employee. So beginning the 1st of January, but no later than July 1st, we have to report any event that occurred between January 1st, 2020 and January 1st, 2023. So we have to go back and retroactively report anything that occurred during that time. And then the whole point of that is they're not trying to review each of the case for possible action. It's to create a record for agencies to actually query when hiring new officers. And we have to go through and determine all the cases that meet that criteria. So we've had to go back through and determine which meet the criteria. And a couple of things. The only ones that we can take action for misconduct that occurred prior to January 1st, 2022 is dishonesty, sexual assault, or excessive force. Or if the investigation was completed after January 1st, 2022. So if this is an old case, then post cannot take action on someone's certificate unless it meets one of these 3. So instead of the 9, these are the only 3 per the law that the post commission can take an action on someone's certificate for. Evidentiary standard. So agency administrative investigations or internal affairs investigations, as we call them, we always have to meet the standards of preponderance of evidence. Decertification investigations must meet the evidentiary standard of clear and convincing. So there may be a difference in what we find versus what the finding is by post. And we could sustain an allegation of misconduct that does not rise to the standard needed to recommend decertification. If you want to clear, I already warned Attorney Doimus that if you want an understanding of either of those clearly, more clearly, I'm going to ask the lawyer for that. Suspension or revocation. So basically, if post finds reasonable grounds for revocation or suspension, then they have to notify the peace officer in writing, provide the reasons, then the peace officer may file a request for review by the board or commission. And then within 30 days, and the request must be received within 30 days. And if the officer just takes the notice and doesn't do anything with it and says yes, then that decertification is considered final. They can also choose to voluntarily permanently surrender their certification, but that is the same as a revocation. And once you surrender your certification, you cannot reactivate it. So if they do request, if a peace officer requests a review, then it would go to the Post Accountability Advisory Board, then it goes to the Post Commission, then it would go to an administrative law judge, and then back to the Post Commission. Yes, it's a process. Post has to publish any names of any peace officer whose certification is suspended or revoked and the basis for it. And there's now a national decertification index, and that also has to be reported to the national index. I'm not going to go through this, but this is something that I included so you can go back and refer to it if you want more information on the specific process of the decertification. And they're all the things that we just talked about, but in more detail. Now at separation, same thing where we talked about the end of your career is hopefully you're separating for reason of retirement, but now instead of just entering this in the system, there's a lot more information that goes into the separation form. So you have to put on there whether it's retirement, resignation, resignation in lieu of, involuntary termination and death. You have to submit that to Post within 10 days, and it's got to be signed by the agency under penalty of perjury. And it has to include whether the separation is part of a settlement, criminal, civil, or administrative, or any type of settlement whatsoever. And like I said, things change very rapidly. Yesterday, we voted on an updated form that has more information than even this. So with that, like I said, I know it's a lot of information, but I wanted to make sure you had something to go back to and refer to. And when we talk about SB2 and, really the overall effect that it has upon policing in the state of California, it is significant. It's a whole extremely high level of oversight that did not exist in the state before. So I think, that should help the public understand the level of scrutiny now that goes into, there's always been a high level of scrutiny in California, but now with this, there's a whole nother layer of review in terms of these serious misconduct investigations. The advisory board that looks at these if an officer wants to retain or fight it, so to speak, is an outside panel. I think there's only 2 members that can be from law enforcement on it. There's the commission, there's the administrative law judge, there's lots of things that go into those decisions. But like I said, I think the big takeaway is there's a whole lot of additional oversight. There's a whole lot of additional hiring standards. I didn't go into all the nuts and bolts of the hiring piece because we'll do another training on that. But now we have to look at social media. There's all these different layers now in looking for, trying to uncover and identify bias, including in the psychological exam. Now there's an additional set of questions related to a whole extra layer. It's always been part of it, but now it's a whole extra layer of evaluating someone's bias. So that ends my talking piece of it. Any questions?
Any questions from the commissions? Commissioner Herlinger?
So, do all the agencies have to participate in this? You made it sound like it's voluntary?
So the only thing that is voluntary is participating as a post-participating agency. And if you're a post-participating agency, there's a lot of funding and things that goes with that for the training. So most agencies in California are post-participating agencies. You may get smaller agencies who choose not to become part of post, but all these requirements, whether you're a post-participating agency or not, you have to adhere to. So if you fall under any of these categories, you must, I guess, a good kind of example would be an agency like a Harbor Patrol where, they fall under a different category, but they're still peace officers. They still have to follow and meet all of the requirements that we have to meet in terms of SB2. So that's hiring and reporting.
But they don't necessarily have to be in this.
What we call a post-participating agency.
Yeah, okay. And then the decertification is for the officer, right? It's not for the agency.
Correct. There are other things that could get an agency decertified, but in this particular case, SB2 focuses specifically on certification for the officer.
Thank you.
Any questions? I have a couple. SB2 is a big step forward in transparency and accountability, and knowing or hearing that certain officers were rehired at other departments. This has just been a big relief, knowing that that SB2 is going to eliminate that possibility. So I was really excited when it came into fruition and is now, now actually being done. So I have a couple of questions. Do all states require certification?
No.
And so California, how is that regulated? Is there audits in police departments that make sure that these reporting entities are, reporting information to post? How are we making sure that departments are reporting?
So, part of this is that we're required to report. We would be breaking the law for not reporting. So, as part of this as well, citizens can actually make complaints directly to Post.
Oh,
So let's just say someone feels that the department has not done their own due diligence and, ignored their complaint and didn't appropriately report. If it now comes to Post, Post is then going to turn around and say to the agency, notify the agency, we received this complaint. Can you provide us what you have done? So there's another layer where, no, they're not coming and auditing, because that is not part of the legislation. And I can tell you that is the audits that already occur, they come in and audit all of our background and all of our hiring stuff. So all of that is covered, but the complaint piece is a little more difficult. But like I said, citizens can report, and there's a direct portal on Post website that they are going to be able, that they can report to. So if they feel like an agency hasn't reported and they feel this officer should have been decertified, there is another layer and way for them to then say, hey, someone needs to look at this. And then they're going to go to the agency, they're going to ask the agency to, what did you do about this? And if the agency says, we didn't do anything, then Post is going to say, well, you have to do an investigation and provide us with that. So there are some additional checks and balances with the system.
great, thanks. And then do allegations that are unfounded or considered unsubstantiated, do those stay on Post records?
Anything that goes to Post stays with Post for 30 years.
Wow. Any, Commissioner Dozer?
My question, Chief, is do you have occasion to hire officers that are from other states, out-of-state officers?
Occasionally.
And is there any prohibition on states that don't seem to have the equivalent process with Post and knowing the background of the officers you're hiring?
So typically, most states and most agencies are cooperative. We will go out and we will review their personnel. When someone is coming from out of state and asking, us to hire them as what we consider quote a lateral, we still go to that state and do a site visit. We still do a home visit. We go talk to the family. We go to the agency. We get all the references. We ask to go see their discipline because the officer has signed a release form. So we still do all of our due diligence. I think that hopefully overall, as we move forward with different federal legislation, it would be my hope that there is a standardized system across the country in terms of decertification. There's way more states than there used to be that use that decertification index. But in terms of what we do here, we always do our due diligence. We still go to the state, we still visit, and get all the references. We do a site visit and still look at all of their records.
Thank you.
And I have one last question. When a new officer is in the probationary period and they are, there's an allegation of the serious misconduct, is that considered training or is that decertifiable?
Depends on the allegation, depends on the results of the investigation.
Any other questions? Oh,
So how is Post funded? Is it a state agency? or-
Yes.
So they just get tax money from?
Yeah, they,
I mean, It's a,
It's a significant, yeah, it's a significant, and as a post commissioner, like yesterday, we get all the reports from the finance committee, and we, as the post commission, actually have to approve all of their overall expenditures, all their contracts actually have to come through the commission, besides the fact that they have to go through state appropriations. So they have received additional money, and they've had to build this new division from the state as a result of this new legislation. But there is accountability in that sense too, because like I said, the post commission actually has to approve all their contracts and expenditures.
do the agencies have to, are they assessed to belong to Post? Or it's just like,
No, you are assessed. If you want to be a post participating agency, you are assessed. All of your, if you want to be, let's say you haven't been a post participating agency for many years,
okay,
like you've just existed as you are, and now you want to become a post participating agency, there's actually a whole assessment that has to go through. You have to submit a letter of intent, and then you have to go through a whole process where they actually review every single employee that you have, all the backgrounds to make sure that you meet all the requirements, and that you've met the necessary training to become a post participating agency.
yeah, when I said assessed, I mean, does our department have to pay to belong?
No.
Okay, that,
No, in fact, by belonging, we actually benefit from it because we get reimbursed for a portion of our post reimbursable training. So like in a 2-year period, we're required to do 24 hours of post training. Those classes are post reimbursable, and we get certain money back for the training that we do that is post reimbursable. So it actually pays to be part of post.
okay, thank you.
thank you for this informative presentation. My hope is that we will be able to make this information available in little small chunks, because this is the type of legislation that builds public trust and allows folks to see the transparency taking place. So moving on to,
Oh, we need to open for public comment.
oh, that's right,
Public
thank you. Is there anyone from the public in person or online that would like to make a comment on this item?
So Chair Rodriguez, we do not have anybody in person, but I'm going to make an announcement for those who are participating via Zoom. Please raise your hand within the app if you would like to speak on this item. And we do not have any speakers on this item, so we'll
Okay.
continue. Item number 7, overview of the Santa Barbara Police Department's use of force policy and investigation process.
So Commander Corbett's going to give this presentation, but as you listen to her very thoughtful presentation, I want you to keep in mind that we are currently evaluating our use of force policies, practices, how we investigate uses of force, and looking at best practice. So we're doing policy updates, and we're doing other updates to how we investigate, and the process that she's going to explain to you today. Not that we weren't before, but we're just doing it in a more holistic, formalized way, where we're looking for opportunities to recognize where there's areas of improvement, but in areas of training that we can do better in, but also opportunities to recognize when officers do a great job with de-escalation. So a much more holistic review and approach to our overall use of force procedures. So this is going to continue to evolve as we move forward. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through it. This is the use of force reforms, and this process is something that I've only introduced in the last 2 months. So it is new to the agency, but something that I think is beneficial. So
Good afternoon. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about use of force, which is a very sometimes stressful topic for people to talk about. So we'll go through our policies and some of our procedures, and then I'll take some questions. So am I correct in understanding that you received the policy prior? Okay. So at the very top of our policy, it talks about the departments that our highest priority is safeguarding the sanctity of life, dignity, and liberty of all persons. Officers shall demonstrate this principle in their daily interactions with the community they are sworn to protect and serve. In that mission, we want to use a minimal reliance on the use of force, understanding that, as the chief said, our use of force is under constant evaluation. So it's a very important topic and serious responsibility, and so we constantly evaluate it. That being said, no policy can anticipate every conceivable situation and every possible circumstance that our officers may face. So in all circumstances, our officers are expected to exercise sound, reasonable judgment, critical decision-making, and employ their training that they've received. Section 300.3 says officers shall only use that amount of force that is reasonably appears necessary, given the facts and the totality of the circumstances known to or perceived by the officers at the time of the events, at the time that occurs. And so part of that is in looking at it, we don't use 20/20 hindsight. We use the hindsight and understanding that what did the officer know and see at the time that the use of force occurred. In that, we are going to talk a little bit about our training, because we do significant amounts of training within the use of force area. We're on a 2-year cycle that mimics our post cycle, and all officers and sergeants are required to attend regular training in use of force tactics, which includes de-escalation, bias-based policing, and crisis intervention training. This is just some of the training that we do within a 2-year cycle. Our bias-based policing, our crisis intervention training. We have 8-hour training that every officer has been through, and we have 40-hour training that a number of our officers have been to. Crowd control training, use of force training, which includes de-escalation, strategic communications training, arrest and control, less lethal options training, active shooter training, and patrol rifle and tactical firearms training. So our officers on a 2-year cycle are regularly employing our use of force training and the de-escalation and bias-based policing within every 2-year cycle. In addition to that training, this slide here, the picture on the slide, we have community partners that come in and do additional briefing training on top of that. So this training here specifically was one of our community partners in Alzheimer's that came in and trained our teams on responding to persons with Alzheimer's. We have autism training and various other community partners that do regular training in our briefing. So when we consider the factors that officers use to determine the reasonableness of force, I put 6 of them up here, but our policy actually lists 19 different factors that are considered. And part of those, are what our officers need to think about and what we think about when we consider what use of force, if we're going to use force, and what that force is going to be. Some of these are the apparent immediacy and severity of the threat to officers, the effects of suspected alcohol or drugs, the proximity of weapons, prior contacts with the subject. Do we know the subject to be violent? Have we had to use force before? So there's a series of different things that we need to consider, and we can't even capture all of them. So in our policy, we also have a duty to intercede, which is also captured under SB2. Any officer present and observing another law enforcement officer or employee using force that is clearly beyond which is necessary as determined by an objectively reasonable officer under the circumstances shall, when in a position to do so, intercede and prevent a use of unreasonable force. This is in our policy, and it's also in our training. In addition to that, we train on de-escalation tactics and alternative tactics. And looking at the time and circumstances, if they reasonably permit, when we're in the middle of an incident or an event, when community and officer safety would not be compromised. That's our key sentence right there. When community and officer safety would not be compromised, officers should consider actions that may increase officer safety and decrease the need to use force by using additional resources, and some of those are going to be community resources, some of our mental health community members and resources that we have, formulating alternative plans, with responding officers before entering an unstable situation that doesn't need immediate intervention, slowing the scene down and slowing things down, or any other tactics that we may be able to increase the safety of both officers and the subjects involved and reduce risk. Our crisis intervention training and some of the resources that we have through them is something that we use quite often in this. So what is considered a use of force? I'm going to start at the top here. It starts at kind of a lower level and then works its way up. So a control hold with subject resistance, and that's physical pressure, something outside of our verbal commands that we have to use to encourage compliance. Leg restraints, which would be a hobble device if somebody needs that to help calm the situation. A wrap device, which I put a picture of what the wrap is, so a picture's worth 1,000 words. We've had the wrap device for several years, and when we have a violent or violently resisting suspect, this is something that helps calm the situation down, keeps them safe, and keeps officers safe. A takedown, which is exactly what it sounds like. Sometimes when we have somebody who is violently resisting, holding them incapacitated on the ground is the safest place to be until we can calm the situation down. And then there's a series of other use of force on the bottom there. The right side of this slide has the 2022 statistics of the use of force that we used within our department with the numbers that go with that. As you can see, takedowns and control hold or grappling covers most of the uses of force that were used. Officer responsibilities after a use of force incident. And so this would be on scene when there is a use of force that happens. So for the officers, both the primary and any other additional officers that are on scene, first they're expected to provide first aid if necessary, alert communications, that's our 911 center, to request medical, additional officers, and if there is any use of force, they have to request a supervisor and a crime scene investigator respond to the scene. To secure and protect the scene, to provide statements to the supervisor when they arrive, and also then to prepare and complete reports as necessary detailing the facts of the use of force. Once the sergeant or supervisor responds to the scene, they're expected to also ensure that medical care for the suspect and officers if needed, determine if more resources are needed, ensure that CSI is on scene. We take photographs for all use of force incident, either to show that there are or there's an absence of any injuries. The supervisor also is expected to interview the suspects, the officers, and all witnesses as to what they experienced and the use of force incident, ensure the safety of the officers and suspects, review all the reports, and then complete a fairly thorough use of force report, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, and notify the watch commander that there was a use of force. So for 2022, we had 45,111 contacts, of which 147 resulted in a use of force. So what that comes down to is 99.67% of contacts did not result in any use of force. On the right side of the slide, you'll see that it is broken down by race based on the statistics and the reporting that we have. So the Santa Barbara Police Department now, the chief had said a couple months ago, she brought in a new use of force reporting form. We've always done a use of force review. It is a more thorough, comprehensive review, and it's forms that must be completed by all supervisors for every single use of force incident. The form, just so that you understand the comprehensive nature of these reviews, is completed by the sergeant or the supervisor on scene. It's then routed to the commander for review, the assistant chief, and finally to community accountability. So every single use of force goes through this process. And this ensures that there's a very thorough review of every incident and then debriefing or, the training that comes with every one of those if needed. I'm going to show you the slides. I don't expect you to read them. Obviously, they're very small. This is just the instructions on how to complete the form. And so at a later time, you can read through this, but this is what all supervisors and everybody that has any responsibility to do with the use of force forms has for instructions. The forms are 4 pages. It starts here, obviously we collected data such as names and the type of force used. And then there's this is a digital form that goes through and then is captured. The hard copy with all of the signatures at the very end comes to my office. And so it goes through a very thorough process for each and every one that talks about the interview with the witnesses, the de-escalation tactics, making sure that all the videos and photos are collected, that everything is within policy, and if not, then it bears discussion. So each and every, I really want to impress that each and every use of force is taken seriously. They all go through even what we would consider a very low-level use of force that we capture, a control hold, or something along those lines, to make sure that you understand that, and the commission really can trust that every use of force is taken seriously, because we know what a serious responsibility it is.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
So, in the material we got, there was a reference to a vested officer. What does that mean? An officer is just wearing a vest at the time of or?
So it's my best understanding that a vested officer is going to be our certified sworn post officer. Vest is not going to refer to what they're
Okay.
actually wearing,
All
yes.
right. And then my other question is, how do you count a contact? In other words, if 4 officers show up, is that 1 contact or is it 4?
That's 1 contact. If we receive a call for service, if we make a traffic stop, that's 1 contact.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions? I've heard the term use of force matrix used in the past. Does the Santa Barbara Police Department use a matrix?
We do not use a matrix, no.
And can you explain for the public what a matrix is?
I see the chief ready to.
The use of a matrix is really an outdated form of use of force policy. That means, when you look at a matrix, that means you basically, there's been different ones. There's a matrix, there's been a step ladder, there's been all sorts of different ones. But basically, what that does is limits the officer's ability to make and evaluate what needs to be done at that moment based on the situation. That their thought process then has to go through this whole matrix of, well, if this happens, then I can use this, or this happens, then I can use this. And you want officers to be trained in using the lowest level of force based on the situation that they have at hand. That's really the key to really good use of force training and compliance, and using the least amount of force as possible. The matrix gets really confusing for officers and is not best practice. When you look at use of force science, it's not supported by the science of it, because there is a lot of use of force, quote unquote, it's actually science. How the body responds, how an officer's body responds, how your decision-making is impacted. There's all sorts of different things that go into the thought process of use of force. And that's why the training piece is so critical, because it's how an officer understands how their body responds, not getting tunnel vision, being able to step back. We always talk about slow down. Understand, hopefully time is on your side, which is not always the case, but evaluating in that, and then, like I said, you shouldn't have to use, I shouldn't have to strike someone before I can use pepper spray, right? OC spray. Then that's kind of what that ladder does, or the matrix does. It says you have to do this before you can use this. And then sometimes what happens then is that you've used multiple levels of force instead of just one appropriate level of force.
Thank you. In the reporting, is an incident considered an action that's taken, such as, let's say, a scenario where a taser was used and then that didn't work, so then they used a wrap? Would that be 2 incidences or 1?
That would be considered 1 incident, and we would report the highest level of force used in that incident. So in each of these reporting, it is the highest level of force that was used in that incident.
Okay. And then the number 147, is that solely force that an officer used against an individual, or does that include force that an individual used against an officer?
That is the number of forces that officers used against. That doesn't account for any resistance or injuries that officers may have sustained. So
Okay.
that is just officers only.
And when you do the full reporting, or maybe my request is that when you do the full reporting, can you also include number of injuries included in or occurred during an incident?
Are you referring to injuries for officers, suspects, or both?
I would like to see injuries to suspects.
Okay.
Is that already currently being used in your data reporting?
Do you want to?
We already collect that data.
Okay, great. Well, just personally speaking, I did a ride-along a couple weeks ago, and there was a pretty significant incident that occurred that required or could have allowed for a much more heavy use of force, and the officer used a very little amount of force to subdue the suspect. And that was one of the things that I was most impressed with and walked away just with my eyes open, that the amount of training that required that officer to automatically use the lowest amount of force possible, it just made me really proud. Commissioner Dozer?
To follow up on Commissioner Rodriguez's request, I guess, for information regarding injuries to suspects, if we are going to do that, then we should have a complete picture, and I'd like to know the injuries to officers as well.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you for that informative report.
Chair Rodriguez will check if there's public comment on
Thank
this
you.
item. It doesn't look like we have anybody in chambers who'd like to speak, so I'll make an announcement for those who are participating via Zoom. If you would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand within the app. And it doesn't look like we have any public comment. We will go on to item number 8, Introduction to Santa Barbara Fire Department Incidents and Data/Metrics.
Chair Rodriguez, members of the commission, good afternoon. Chris Males, your fire chief. We're going to do a rather brief introduction to data and metrics for the fire department. Long gone are the days of communities saying, hey, I think we need a fire station over here, or hey, we don't need a fire station over here. Stations and fire departments are staffed using data to best analyze on a daily basis whether fire stations are in correct locations with the correct apparatus, responding in a correct manner. And it's quite complex. I've mentioned the standards of cover study, which, by the way, has just been given to our city manager and will be going to council soon. The consultant spent 3 years looking at incidents for the city of Santa Barbara. It's quite a long spreadsheet, and looked into all of our response times, every portion of our response times. And there's really 4 portions of the response times that we'll get into. But what I've chosen to do today is to just start with the very basics. And as we proceed through our presentations over the year, then I'll start introducing new topics, and we'll drill down, get more granular into each portion of our response time. Most people think, oh, 911 gets called, fire truck shows up. Okay, well, it's a little more technical than that. So we'll get into a few more of the details. But as I said, no longer can departments use anecdotal information to justify changes or enhancements to service. We really have to look at the data. It's key to all public agencies, and obviously you saw from the police department's presentation, data also drives their decision-making. What do we do to get the data? How do we get data? Every time someone calls 911, as soon as that first indication of a ring, a telephone ringing in dispatch, as soon as that phone makes its presence known, the call makes its presence known in dispatch, begins the time. Our dispatch center actually has a time called 911 pickup time. And that is how quickly after the 911 call comes in does a dispatcher pick it up. So what we get at the fire department is exactly the chronological movement of an incident. So what happens is excuse me, we have a live feed that comes from our CAD, our computer-aided dispatch, and it downloads to our mobile data computers and our reporting tablets that we use. I'll get into in just a second of what we report and how we report. But basically, as soon as the call comes in, the call is processed, the call is dispatched. The units go en route, they go on scene. All of that is recorded in real time down to the second. It's actually based on the atomic clock, so it's accurate between dispatch centers. So there's no, hey, how come there was a 10-minute delay? That used to happen, but it was only because the clocks weren't synchronized. They're synchronized now. But what we end up with at the end of an incident is our requirement to document. We document the incidents predominantly in two methods. One is what's called NFIRS, which is the National Fire Incident Reporting System. The end of the year, you're watching ABC Nightly News and you hear that there were, X number of structure fires in the United States resulting in X number of civilian deaths, or vehicle accidents are up X percentage. A lot of that, although it can come from police data, also comes from fire department data. So every single time one of our crews goes on a call, they document that call. They categorize that call into a number of different areas, and then they write a report that's associated with that. And then that report is uploaded to the state, which is then uploaded to the national database, the NFIRS database. Also, if we go on an EMS incident, an emergency medical services incident, we fill out a second report. And that is what's called an EPCR, Electronic Patient Care Report. You'll see at the bottom, we use a company called ImageTrend. Our entire county uses ImageTrend, from every fire department to the ambulance company, all use ImageTrend. This is a real-time patient care reporting document that we use iPads, that as we're en route to the call, we can pull up our response times. We can start to document the incident. When we get on scene, we often have one of our persons that is documenting the incident also. And then we actually, for transfer of care, our fire engine will upload the incident to the ambulance transporting unit. The ambulance transporting unit takes the patient to the hospital. Then it's uploaded into the patient's chart at the hospital. So literally, a nurse up on a floor in the hospital can go back and look at the pre-hospital care report, and even go back to look to see the first blood pressure that was taken at the scene and all of the response times associated with it. So as I said, we use ImageTrend. So I wanted to start just with our call volume. What did we do in 2022? How many calls for service did we go on? But first, we are trending up. We trend up every year. I think I mentioned to this commission, I think 30 years ago when I started, we were at 5,500 calls. We're now at, this last year, 11,400 calls. So our typical call volume is going up, and our EMS call volume is also going up. So I'm just going to start with very basic categories. We're going to look at fires. We're going to look at rescue and EMS. We're going to look at hazardous conditions, service calls, good intent calls, and false alarms. So I'm going to digress just for a second. As Chief Gordon was giving her presentation, you may have seen me texting. We actually got a request to send 6 of our personnel on our heavy rescue unit right now to Bishop, California, for a pre-position storm-related incidents. So that would be one incident. We'll find out whether they're going to go in the next little bit of time, but we have actually heavy rescue specialists staged all over the state for different storm-related incidents, and so our folks would be going, and that would be categorized under a rescue and EMS incident. So under fires, the fire department responded to 211 fires, and that is everything from structure fires to vehicle fires to vegetation fires, trash can fires. I didn't want to make it too busy, so I can tell you that we had about 30 building fires last year. And when I say fire, that means that there was fire upon arrival or had quickly been extinguished prior to arrival. This is not an investigation of smoke in the backyard or something like this. This is actual structure fires. But you'll see that it's a small percentage of our business. It's actually about 2% of our business. That's a little bit low in the industry. A lot of fire departments are trending in the 2 to 5% range. But still, that's a large number of incidents. One thing I also want to mention is you'll see at the bottom that we had 11,405 incidents. That's not what we call unit movements, okay? So a structure fire has 5 apparatus that go to that call. That's one incident with 5 unit movements. So when we look at unit movements, we're up in the 14 to 15,000 range. So, we send 2 fire engines to a cardiac arrest. We send a fire engine and a ladder truck to an elevator call, elevator rescue, things like that. So incidents and unit movements are different. Rescue and EMS is by far our largest percentage. If we look strictly at medical emergencies, it's actually 63%, but the 68% includes traffic accidents. It can include, actually a separate is extrication. Say if someone is stuck in an uncompromising position, not really a traffic accident, but if someone is, say, stuck under heavy machinery or something like that. Trench rescue, surf rescue, water rescue. Those are all embedded into that 7,822 calls for service. The next category is hazardous conditions, and I missed a parentheses, but not involving a fire. So that could be fuel leak from a vehicle. That could be a propane tank that's leaking. That could be wires that are arcing or power, lines down, things like that. Overheated motors, and actually aircraft standby, which is by far the most common incident that our airport firefighters respond to, is what's called an aircraft standby, where they are called out to wait and watch to make sure a plane lands safely. The next category are service calls. Those include water leaks, juveniles or kids locked in vehicles, assisting the police or other governmental agency. Let's say the police has someone barricaded in a building and they need a ladder from us to get into or on top of a building, something like that. Assisting an invalid, so someone who is unable to, say, get up off the floor on their own. Now, we do go on those quite often, but what happens when we get there is we often find them that they have some type of an injury. So then that incident actually becomes an EMS call. Then we have good intent calls is the next one. And actually, we have almost 1,900 calls for service. We were canceled en route. That sounds like a high number, but I like to hear that number, and I'll tell you why. That tells me people are calling for help. They're calling, and then they're going, ooh, maybe I got control of this situation. Dad has locked his 2-year-old child in a vehicle, and they call for us to come unlock the vehicle for them, but while we're en route, they found the key and they cancel us. The most common thing that we're canceled for is traffic accidents that are dispatched initially as non-injury, and then law enforcement will get on scene and say it's non-injury, dispatched as injury and then downgraded to non-injury. The next one are false calls, and that's just false alarms. That's just a fire alarm that goes off. Somebody called and said someone fell off their bicycle, and you get there and the person's sitting on a park bench going, I didn't fall off the bike at all. It was just a false call. We have more of those with cell phones. People will hear traffic accidents. People will hear something happen and will call. So all of those contribute to our call volume. What is an ideal call volume for our department? First of all, when we see the standards of cover study, you'll find out that our stations are actually very strategically located, and our call volume is with what I would call within normal limits. One thing that we look at is what's called unit hour utilization, or UHU. Take a 24-hour shift. We don't want our apparatus busy more than 10% of the day. Now you say, well, that's not a lot. That's 2.4 hours a day. That is strictly on incidents. That means from the time of dispatch to the time that they go available. The reason we want to keep that low is because statistically, if a fire engine, say the Mesa Fire Engine, Station 6, if they have a higher UHU than 10%, that means that there's a high propensity of an additional call happening while they're on a call. So statistically, if we can keep them under 10%, then they will handle the majority of calls in their area and be able to clear statistically. Next. Okay, so what are our goals? So that was our call volume, but I want to talk and transition a little bit to response times, and then over the next few months, we'll get into our response times more. Chief Gordon talked about post. The equivalent of post in the fire service is the NFPA, National Fire Protection Administration. They're the national body that writes documents, although they're not, departments are not legally bound by them, by some of them that are, so you'll have a fire code, you'll have a building code within the state, but then you also have your National Fire Protection Administration. They're really more advisory, but departments really try to adhere to them because they're based on national standards. So our response times, we really try to adhere to NFPA 1221. Looking at the second bullet, TRT stands for Total Response Time at the SPFD. We shoot for 6 minutes and 15 seconds. Now you say that's a long time. That actually is, again, as soon as the 911 call hits the dispatch center, the time starts. So we want our dispatchers to process the call within 60 seconds. However, our dispatchers also do emergency medical dispatch. They also interrogate the caller medically and give medical instructions. NFPA 1221 actually says that the dispatch center can have 90 seconds to do that because its care is really beginning on the telephone by our dispatchers. Turnout time, so call processing time, 60 to 90 seconds. As soon as the call is sent to the station, and I always say the lights go on, as soon as that alert hits the station, then begins the second phase, which is the turnout time. And that is what's also known as reflex time. That is from the time the firefighter gets the alert, and we get the alerts, by the way, we get audio, we get lights, and we also get them on our phone right away. So every firefighter, when they come on duty, they can go into an app and they put what apparatus they're on. And as soon as that call hits the station, it's also hit their phones. And they also have a map to the call right away. So as they're going to the fire engine, if they're not familiar with the street, they actually have the map and the call location while they're going to the apparatus. We want our firefighters to turn out in 1 minute. That is really tough. That's really tough to do. We have more success with our smaller footprint fire stations. Station 1 is almost a quarter of an entire block. There's multiple apparatus there that our folks are responsible for. It's 2 stories. They hustle. There's no lagging. It's just difficult to get out of the station sometimes in that short period of time. And then travel time, we'd like it to be 4 minutes. And yes, we build an extra 15 seconds or so into it. 4 minutes is also really difficult. Travel time, that's from the time they leave the station to arrival at the scene. That's also really difficult, especially with the streets in Santa Barbara. One of my former battalion chiefs used to say, you can't get there from here in Santa Barbara. And really what he was referring to was that, we have such narrow streets that it takes time to get places, which really contributes back to our standards of cover study when we look, why does a fire department of 23 square miles have 8 fire stations? It's because of the terrain of our town. and getting up to the Riviera and getting up to Upper La Cumbre and to the Mesa, it takes time to get there. So we shoot for 6 minutes and 15 seconds total. We're close to that right now. We're close to that. So just to review, call processing time is from the 911 call pickup through interrogation to the initial station alerting. We use an automated alerting system, which was started in 2020. Instead of the dispatcher physically putting the call out with his or her voice, it's a text-to-voice program. The dispatcher gets the call type, confirms the address and phone number, and hits one button. And when that button is hit, it automatically goes to the station. A data package is sent over the internet, and an automated voice puts the call out. Why is that important? Because that allows the dispatcher to remain focused on the caller. The redundant part of the job of putting the call out over the radio is handled by the computer. So what we did with this was we changed the focus from the radio to the telephone. So we know the call can get out to the firefighters. It focuses more on our patients or our people calling for help. If this works, I'll give you an example just to play it for you. This is an example, in case you haven't heard it, of what our station alerting system sounds like. Oops, oh boy, that blew that one, hold on.
16:38 hours. Engine 71. Traffic accident with injuries. East Figueroa Street and State Street. Engine 71. Traffic accident with injuries. East Figueroa Street and State Street.
So that package is delivered to the station in less than a half a second. As soon as that, the dispatcher gets the call type, gets a recommendation of the apparatus, they send the call, it's at the station in a half a second. And it's on their phones in a half a second. So it's a big move to get us to shorten our overall response times. And again, as I mentioned, travel time is wheels rolling. And then on scene is wheels stopped. And again, all of the above is total response time. Where can we make changes? We can make changes, or we can strive to be better every day with call processing, with turnout time. Travel time, we have to be careful how much we try to decrease travel time, because we put pressure on firefighters to get to calls quicker, then it can compromise safety. So I put incredible trust in our engineers or apparatus drivers. Our fire apparatus are 40,000 pounds. They don't stop on a dime, and we have to drive very, very safely. If we don't get to the call, we can't help the person. So travel time is a bit tough to change. However, one of the things the city will be looking into in the next few years is what's called traffic preemption devices. And those are lights that are on the fire truck that trigger the light standards at intersections, changes them from red to green. We were looking at it this year, however, with our move to regional fire dispatch that I've talked about, we actually have to look at it on a county-wide basis now, because we have to make sure we have the same system, because our fire engines could be in the San Ynez Valley running calls with the move-up system that'll be in place. So that's total response time. So that's what we're going to be talking about over the next few months. I'll be giving you data by station, by call, et cetera. And that's it. On behalf of the women and men of the fire department, thanks for supporting our mission, and our department values are always service, respect, and integrity. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Questions or comments from the commissioners? Commissioner Dozier?
Yeah, this might be a dumb question.
No.
Do you, City Fire, I assume, have mutual agreements with County Fire for assistance should your people be off doing something else?
Great question, Commissioner Dozier.
I feel better,
yeah.
thank you.
What's that? I'm sorry?
I said I feel better. It's not a stupid question.
No, not at all. The mutual aid system, which is what we have all over the nation, was actually started as a result of the Bel Air fire down in Los Angeles. Since then, it has become the envy of the world. The mutual aid system that exists in the whole United States, but more specifically in the western region, and then also drilling down to the state, down to one of a couple of regions in the state, or all the way down into the county, is amazing. But I need to qualify a little bit. We have really two agreements. One is called automatic aid, and the other is called mutual aid. Automatic aid is a contract that is set up to send the closest available resource regardless of jurisdiction. What I mean by that, I'll give you a perfect example. Earl Warren Showgrounds is actually in the county of Santa Barbara, but the city fire station, which is at 2500 Modoc, less than a quarter mile away, is closer to that call. So we have an automatic aid agreement with the county of Santa Barbara that we will go to that call. We will handle that call because we're closer. Those are predetermined areas, even down to the street, where we have in our computer system that we will request or we will give an automatic aid engine. Then we have the mutual aid system. The mutual aid system, again, can go all over the United States. But we do have a computerized system that actually gets down to not only how many fire apparatus are available, but who are on that apparatus. So I'll give you an example. If there was, say, a vegetation fire up in the Sierras, and they needed rigs from Santa Barbara County, the request actually comes through the state or the federal to the county. The county then has predetermined every day, they have apparatus that are set up who are going to go on that incident. So believe it or not, at 8 o'clock in the morning when our folks go on duty, they know whether they're up to go out of town. We have predetermined resources that are going to be going. Our folks, I just mentioned the urban search and rescue incident. Those folks knew this morning with the apparatus that they were on that they could be punched out to an incident. So the majority of our mutual aid is in response to an actual incident that has occurred. But one thing that has been going on in the state in the last couple of years is what's called preposition. And that is the state actually has funding available to look at target areas and say, you know what, there's maybe going to be a fire here. Why don't we pre-position some resources into this area of a community to be able to respond to the incident? The best example I can give to you for that is the holiday fire that happened in Goleta. That was the first time that the state had authorized a pre-position, and there were 5 extra fire engines sitting at Cayo Real and Fairview when that fire broke out. They had been moved to Santa Barbara because they knew an incident was going to happen. So very long answer to your question, but it's an elaborate, really involved system that's, again, the envy of we have people from all over the world coming to look at it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Welcome.
Commissioner Herlinger?
So is there any follow-up to the ambulance contract that you were speaking about at the last meeting?
Sure. Follow up to the ambulance contract. The last time we spoke, it was going to the Procurement Review Committee. They also denied County Fire's a protest or appeal. However, in their appeal, they noted that there was only a finite area that they were allowed to consider. They weren't allowed to consider the large appeal. They only were allowed to consider certain things. So where it's at right now is that it's going to the Board of Supervisors on April 4th. And the Board of Supervisors will have a number of options that they can take. We're thinking they'll have a number of options they can take, whether they award the contract or ask to take a closer look at things, we don't know.
Any other questions or comments? So you mentioned, Chief Mills, that the calls for service are trending upward. Do you have any theories as to why that's happening?
Well, I think that, as population increases, density increases, and again, we're looking at all calls for service. I could drill down into one type of call for service, and it would take some, research, but people are just busier. People are out and about. People are traveling longer distances. People are commuting longer distances. Just life is busy. Things happen. People are out. Any number of things are contributing to it. Now, one thing that we're looking at in the future, in fact, the new regional dispatch is going to be incorporating a bit of a new system. We use emergency medical dispatch, which is called EMD, to categorize the calls as far as the severity of the calls. When someone calls in on 911, our dispatchers ask questions, and then a unit is, the severity of the call is actually logged by computer. And then a level of response occurs. It's not always just a shotgun approach where everybody just goes. As this system becomes more scientific, just because you call 911 and ask for an ambulance doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're going to get. Because with the call interrogation, we may be able to send something better to you, with something more refined. When the regional dispatch goes into place, they're actually going to be using that same system, but for fire calls. So they are structured interrogation calls, and then after that happens, they get what's called a launch determinant, and that launch determinant says, do we send 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 rigs? So as that system becomes more scientific, it could help to temper down some of the call volume. But life's just getting busier. This town's getting busier.
I'm wondering if increased development is affecting how many people are calling for service? And if that's true, are police and fire included in conversations around new development?
So we'll start with the development. So new development doesn't necessarily mean more fire calls, okay, because the development is often state-of-the-art building codes, fire codes, et cetera. But population density does come into effect. If you build an apartment complex where there was a house, you've got more people driving cars, riding bicycles, walking on the street, et cetera. So that does come into play. Is the fire department involved? Yes, we do get involved. Our fire prevention division is tied in with community development, and any kind of development our fire department is involved with.
Okay, thank you. And then can you remind me when we're going to get a summary of the standards of coverage story?
So my understanding is it's going to go, the city administrator has it right now, and then it should be delivered to council shortly, but I don't have an actual date yet for you.
And my last question is, regardless of the decision of the ambulance contract, either way, will it have an effect on calls for service
So the calls for service.
or response time?
So for the fire department, no. For the contract, it remains to be seen as far as what the contract parameters will be. And that's the negotiation between the county and whoever gets the contract. It will be a performance-based contract, which means that they'll be required to respond in a certain amount of time, certain percentage, which then translates to a number of ambulances that they'll have to have on duty.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that in the first draft of the RFP that came out, the county wanted to increase the response time requirements from 8 minutes to 10 minutes. And I can tell you that the county fire chiefs pushed back on that and got it back down to 8 minutes. Because believe it or not, the difference in 2 minutes means that there can be less ambulances on the street to be able to adhere to that contract. So we were able to get it back to 8 minutes. So the contract is set now that when it does go to negotiations, it will be an 8-minute time requirement. So, but that's a pretty loaded question because it depends on, how many 911 calls and et cetera.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair Rodriguez will check if there's public comment on this item. There is nobody in person in chambers wanting to speak, so we'll check for those who are listening via Zoom. If you'd like to speak on this item, please raise your hand within the app. And we do not have any speakers on this item. Item number 9 is going to be commission and staff communications.
So this is a time when commissioners can share about meetings that they've attended or conversations they've had, or bring up something that might not be on the agenda but does not need to be placed on the agenda. So Commissioner Dozer or Herlinger? Nope. Okay. I would like to just share that I attended a ride-along I mentioned before for both the police department and the fire department. The 3 takeaways that I left with from the police department was it was an action-packed evening. And the officer I rode with was pretty phenomenal. And there was one particular event that occurred where I was surprised with the number of community members who stepped up to help in that process. What that showed me, or what that demonstrated to me, was that at least in that particular neighborhood, they showed that they had trust in police and what the police were doing, and that they wanted to support the police in that situation. I was also struck with how calm she was during a very stressful situation, and how other officers came to her to make sure that that her well-being was attended to, and she was professional. She described what was going on after, she took care of her business, and then, as I mentioned before, the very low level of force that she used in a situation that could have called for something greater. And so it took me probably about a week to process all of what occurred that whole evening, and it made me remember why I'm not a first responder, and just really grateful for the first responders that we have in our community. I also did a ride-along with the fire department, and thankfully it was less action-packed, but I had wonderful conversations with the folks that I met with, and I ended up taking myself on a field trip to other police departments, so it was nice to interact with the different departments. So if you haven't already signed up for your ride-alongs, I encourage you to do so. It was I've done one before, and I've interacted with police before, but it was definitely an eye-opening experience. So thank you for that. Any other comments? Okay. Well, I think we can adjourn this meeting of the Fire and Police Commission at 5:30 p.m.